Hi, everyone. This is Rosemary Coates in Silicon Valley. I'm your host for this edition of the Frictionless Supply Chain Podcast. I'm the executive director of the Reshoring Institute, where we help companies bring back or expand their manufacturing in the US. And I'm a contributing writer to Supply Chain Management Review. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Anne Dempsey, the Executive Vice President of Land, Industrial, and Distressed Assets at Colliers. Now, we've talked about the importance of site selection and supply chain management before in this podcast, and I think supply chain professionals need to step up and have a seat at the table when it comes to site selection decisions. We have to have input about how supply chains will adapt to locations, access highways, rail sidings, airports, and seaports. So let's all learn as much as we can about selecting manufacturing and distribution sites so we can help our companies make better decisions. So let's get started. Welcome, Anne.
Hi.
All right. Tell us about Colliers to start with, and particularly about your part of the business, land, industrial, and distressed properties. Wow, that's a mouthful.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll start out with Colliers. We are the third largest real estate company in terms of revenue in the world. Of the top five real estate companies, we have significantly fewer employees. We only have about 18,000, but we just produce a lot more on a per person basis. We we generate basically 4.6 billion in annual revenues, and we're in 66 countries and we have more than 600 offices throughout the world. Colliers is a full service real estate company, meaning we do brokerage, we do tenant rep, we do landlord rep, we do appraisals, we do property management, all the different types of services that have to do with real estate, even mortgages and things like that. And the one thing about Colliers that's different, and especially when it comes to supply chain stuff, is we are much more entrepreneurial. A lot of these larger companies, they just get so corporate, and each of these companies that's reshoring or onshoring, each of them have different things that they need to look at, and we are much more flexible than our competitors regarding that.
Oh, okay. So, how is the part of the business, the land, industrial, and distressed properties, different from other parts of Colliers? I know you said it was full service and you offer all kinds of things, but this is a particular area of interest to, I think, the supply chain people.
Yeah, well, land at Colliers, and there's not a lot of land brokers at any of these big companies. Really, it's just us and CBRE are the really, big land brokers that are around. And what we're seeing is companies right now, when they go to select a site, you can't just say, I want to be in Chicago. You have to look at so many other things. And so one of the things that we do when we're talking to clients is we take all their criteria. We have one company that we just did a data center for, and their criteria was they needed tremendous amount of power, a lot of water, and there's no employees. I mean, there's 20 employees. So we access to labor and things like that. They're not, high tech, high education type jobs.
Yeah, yeah. So some companies need a lot of employees and access and so forth, others don't, right? So it
Right.
makes a difference in how they make that selection.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, we're working with a Chinese company right now. And they do care about labor because they're going to have labs. So they need a very educated workforce. And they also do have manufacturing too, but they require rail. They are an amino acids company. And so corn is their raw material. And Illinois and Iowa are the largest corn manufacturers. So they're trying to break into the U.S. market, and so locating in the Midwest, that's one of the things that's very important to them.
Yeah,
Now,
gotcha.
as you know, because I know you have a lot of expertise regarding China, we also have governmental regulations that are in play, and there's some states. I believe there's 11 or 12 states right now in the country that will not allow um, uh, uh, companies from China, Russia, North Korea, or Iran to even locate in their state, or they have significant, or they have very strict regulations on where they can actually go.
That's
So,
that's really interesting. We're going to talk about foreign direct investment a little bit in a little bit, but before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about your background. How did you get started in the land asset business? There must be a story there.
well, there is. Well, I'm actually third generation real estate. I have two daughters, so we're now to the fourth generation. But my grandfather started out in Chicago, and when O'Hare Airport came in 1956, he thought people were going to want to be out by the airport, and not drive all the way into downtown Chicago. So he started buying up all the land. And since I was 13 years old, I was in the office doing whatever on holidays and summers and vacations. And so just grew up around the business. And when I went to college, I asked my grandfather, what should I do to get the best education so I can go into real estate? And he said, work for IBM or Xerox, because back then those were the big companies and they had great training programs, and go to either Kellogg or U of C for business school. So I went to Kellogg and I worked for Xerox. And when I finished that, I was 26 years old and doing great at Xerox. So I just stayed for a few more years and finally decided to leave and went into commercial real estate with CBRE September 1st, 2001, 10 days before 9/11.
Wow.
So I went from being a rock star at Xerox to being very humble, let's just say. But looking back, it was actually a very good thing, because it gave no one did anything for like a year and a half when after 9/11 happened in real estate. So it did give me time to really get to know the market, get to know the types of products that we had in the Chicagoland area, and then it all worked out from there. But at the beginning, I had really started in industrial, selling buildings and leasing buildings, mostly on the landlord side. And because of the work that I had done at Xerox, my contacts were all of the like real estate managers, because I did facilities management for Xerox. So a lot of my clients would say, "Hey, Anne, what do you think we should do with this building?" And some of these factories were surrounded by multifamily on three sides of it, and I'm like, "You could either sell it for $1 million as industrial, or we could go to the village and get it rezoned and sell it as residential." So because of that, I ended up. I was at CB at the time, and at CB didn't like that. They didn't like industrial brokers calling multifamily developers. And so David Conweiler at Colliers called me up and said, "You can call anybody you want. Come on over. You can sell land. You can do redevelopment." And so I went over there, and it's been great ever since. So
Oh, that's terrific. Okay. Well, nice to know. There's a journey there. I figured there was a story to tell. So supply chain leaders are always thinking about locations like warehouses and factories and suppliers, and especially in proximity to airports and seaports and rail sidings, and probably most importantly, trucking access to major highways and markets. How do you help your clients work through all those different variables and what's important to them? I know you mentioned already that some industries have different requirements than others, but do you have a process for helping them work through those variables and alternatives?
yes, we do. And actually, we have the best solution, out of all the companies. We have a product called Insight. It's INDSITE. And it's basically a database that pulls from 200 data sets. And this is basically for the United States. We have information for every single county in the United States.
Wow.
And it will pull things. So you put into there that you need rail, you need access to whatever your raw material is. You want to understand labor union risk, um, per county and per location, taxes, incentives, and as I mentioned before, some companies can't go to certain states, and so you need to know those things. There's also companies that weather is an issue for, and so there's just so many different things, labor quality and quantity, and also being, where the best location for where you get your raw materials in and where your client is.
So you work with your clients through a list of those kind of variables. I imagine you have several sessions with them to talk them through what their requirements are
Yeah,
before
and they
you.
usually
Yeah.
don't know at the beginning, and then once you start finding something, then you find out more requirements. So, we like to give them some case studies based on the industry that they're in to kind of jog their memory and say, "Oh yeah, I need that." This Chinese company we're working with right now, they didn't realize that they had a huge water. They just assumed they could get water. And one of the things about the Midwest is we have the Great Lakes, and that's 10% of the world's fresh water, and 10% of the world's fresh water. So luckily, we figured that out soon enough because it makes a big difference. So
Sure. Yeah, I know people don't recognize how important water is to manufacturing. There are a
right,
lot of industries that require a horrendous amount of manufacturing to be part of the process and to cool the manufacturing process down. And there's all kinds of reasons you would use water in manufacturing. So, yeah, that can be a big criteria, especially in places like I live in California. So
yeah,
water
water.
is a
We
big
have
deal
water.
here. Yeah, the same in Arizona and
Yeah,
some of the drier states or more deserty kind of locations. And while it may fit all the other criterias, if there isn't enough water, you probably it's probably not a good match.
right.
So
And one
I
of the
know I
just one more thing. One of the things that we've also found is usually a company's real estate is only about 5% of their annual revenues, and so you think the real estate's so much more, but really 65% of a company's annual revenues have to do with logistics, with their taxes, with their labor, and their utilities. So just picking a site, I mean, there's a lot more to it, and you understand that. So we try to make that's our whole
yeah.
goal: is cost reduction for these companies and avoiding risk.
Yeah, in my experience, when companies making a site selection, they have their facilities people leading the pack, and maybe engineering, and some finance people, but the supply chain people are sometimes left out, and it is such a critical factor
Mhm.
to know how you're going to access a place. How close is it to the airport? Things that are really important to supply chain decisions, and that's why I think it's so essential that supply chain people understand how real estate selection happens and that they have a seat at the table.
Yeah,
So I know industrial real estate is on a growth curve right now. We've seen growth statistics in industrial property, which are kind of skyrocketing at the moment. And we've discussed the coming manufacturing super cycle, which is a term that was coined by Bank of America economists, because all of the money that's coming from the Inflation Reduction Act, the Chips and Science Act, and the Infrastructure Act, all three of those are pushing money into a manufacturing environment in the US. How about land acquisition? Are you seeing ties to this funding yet? I know it's kind of trickling in these days, but there must be some related activity around the funding.
yes, we're seeing a tremendous uptick in land acquisition. I mean, last year I was the number one land broker at Colliers. So, and the Midwest is just on fire right now. I heard a term the other day that I thought, and this kind of explains why the uptick in land is. It used to be just in time for supply chain, and now since COVID, we're finding it's just in case.
Right?
And people want to, we're hoarding more things. So we're seeing an uptick in pharmaceuticals. We're doing a 65-acre Fortune 150 pharmaceutical expansion. EV batteries and semiconductors, of course, are huge. Not so much in the Midwest, but those we know are on the uptick. And also data centers. The Midwest, basically, the Chicagoland area is the second largest area in the country. Virginia's the first. And so, finding power and they want tremendous land sites. Like, if you can get them 1,000 acres, they'll take 1,000 acres.
Wow.
So we are seeing a big uptick in land, and it's not stopping, and they're buying it and holding it just in case. So,
Yeah, and I would think Chicago has less issues with like tornadoes and some of the big flooding and that sort of thing that
and
happens.
yeah,
Yeah, that happens in other parts of the Midwest and in the central US. And of course, we're moving all our data centers out of California in case of earthquakes, right? I
right.
mean,
Well, they're
even
so expensive to build
yeah.
that you just can't risk it. So, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, even small earthquakes, cause enough shaking to affect a data center. So yeah, putting it in a place where it's more stable, you're not likely to have a tornado. Flooding is not so much of a problem in the Chicago area. So there's all kinds of good reasons I would think that Chicago in particular is a very good area for data centers. So I
Um,
know you mentioned you were dealing with a Chinese company and you've dealt with other foreign companies coming to the US. Can you give some other examples of companies, foreign companies that are coming here, and what are they looking for when they're making a site selection?
So we did a Belgium company. It was a plastics company last year. And so them being in the Midwest, for them, it was all about rail. So we did a 250 rail car building for them. It was a 1.2 million square foot building. And a lot of times you can't just, some of these manufacturing companies are so specific with how their building needs to be, with silos and access to the rail and the whole bit, that it's easier just to build from the ground up, as opposed to retooling another existing industrial building. So, so we've seen that. The other thing is, the Chicagoland area is like the crossroads of the United States. I mean, we're right in the middle, so you can go north, south, east, or west. And within I think it's 8 hours. I mean, you can reach like 75% of the population of the United States. So,
Wow.
and then also during COVID, we had some other interesting things. We dealt with airports, and that was because supply chain was so tough at the time. And what we found was that more expensive products like Microsoft and iPhones and pharmaceuticals during COVID, in order to unclog the supply chain, they would actually use planes to fly things in, even though it was more expensive. But it was either that or they weren't going to sell anything.
Right.
So,
Right. I mean, we experienced that port congestion on the
yeah.
West Coast ports. You can probably remember the pictures of all the ships
Oh,
backed up in the port of Los Angeles. Yeah, they
yeah,
couldn't
and
unload for weeks and weeks. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and all the containers on the private streets and all of that. Yeah,
Yeah,
crazy.
but it was because Americans were buying so much stuff from China. We were all sitting at home buying stuff for our houses and computers and all of that. And it caused a tremendous spike in demand for ships that were leaving, container loads that were leaving China in particular and headed for the US West Coast. And then in the process, we also had, kind of a slowdown at the ports. People didn't want to come to work, or they had COVID and couldn't come to work, or there were all kinds of reasons why we weren't unloading as fast as we should have been, in addition to the spike in demand, and that caused a huge mess. Yeah,
Mhm.
air freight wasn't all that much better for a while, for
Right.
several weeks, but I think it did get straightened out faster than the ocean freight was getting straightened out. So yeah, access to O'Hare, I think, is really one of the keys to the Chicagoland area.
Yeah, and actually, it's kind of funny. Access to O'Hare was kind of the issue. We were working with Rockford Airport, which is basically 90 miles. It's basically 60 miles from O'Hare, 90 miles from downtown Chicago. But the difference between Rockford and O'Hare was getting in and out. When you land at O'Hare, it basically took you 8 to 12 hours to get, from wheels down to getting cargo off and onto trucks and then getting it out. Where Rockford, while it was an hour away, still on I-90, you could have wheels down, and within 2 hours you are on the road.
Wow.
So it just, but everyone thinks, I mean, O'Hare is one of the busiest airports, but that's also one of the problems, just like LAX. I mean,
Yeah,
you can
sure.
get out of there. So
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. There were a lot of supply chain people that were looking for alternate routes, not only for air freight, but also sea freight, all over the place. So we were looking for smaller ports or easier ways to offload goods. And this is the kind of flexibility that supply chain people have learned about in the past, say, 10 years or so, that is really important to making these long global supply chains work well.
mhm.
So so companies, foreign companies that are coming here, I guess, have this similar criteria to a domestic company that would be selecting a site.
Yeah.
But they also need to be educated, I guess,
Mhm.
about the environment and how things work in the US. So that's part of your job too, right?
Yes, absolutely. The government regulations, environmental, is also a big thing. And, I mean, for reshoring and everything, one of the things that we're seeing is, wages now in China and stuff are going up. And so the US is able to compete a lot better, with the wages, and automation is also helping that. So bringing, companies, back to the US or into the US, is definitely getting a lot easier now than it was, a few years back when, the labor costs were just so much cheaper that the US just couldn't compete. But now with AI and the wages, evening out, we're seeing, a lot of people say yes, they would rather, come to their market because the US is such a big market out there.
Right.
So we're big
Well,
consumers.
I think, yeah, I think some of the decisions, it goes hand in hand with sustainability also. So when you reduce the length of your long global supply chain down to a closer to your marketplace, you also can address your carbon footprint. The shorter you make that supply chain, the less carbon footprint you have, and that is one of the keys also to reshoring. It goes hand in hand with sustainability programs at most companies. So we're coming to the end of our time here, Anne, and I wanted to ask you, what advice do you have for women and men as they develop their careers in supply chain management? We have a lot of women that are listening that are, mid career and trying to move up. And since you're a senior executive, tell us, what advice do you have for these young people?
Well, for women specifically, and I have two daughters in the business. They also work for Colliers. One works for me. Um, um, to be quite honest, I think real estate is a phenomenal, market, or industry to go into because it gives you a lot of flexibility. You don't always have to be in an office, and you can pretty much work from wherever. So if you want to have a family, I think it's a very, very good career, and your potential is unlimited. I remember working for corporate America, and they really did put a glass ceiling in. And
Yeah.
commercial real estate, for women, there's only 10% women in commercial real estate. Residential is the exact opposite, but for commercial, it's really only 10% women. And as I say, I mean, I walk into a conference and everyone knows my name, and everyone else in the room, is pretty much a white male. So it's easier to be remembered because we do stand out. And I think that's a plus. I mean, I don't look at us as being a minority. I look at it as being an advantage. So, and then I think just real estate in general, is so much fun. And, you're with doing the onshoring and site selection and all that, each one of these is like a puzzle, and you have to figure it out, and none of them are the same. So it's not boring at all. And when you figure it out, you're like, yes, that was great. I mean, we've had failures too. I mean, we had one agricultural company that had all these smart people from all of these big MBA schools, but they laid out their footprint across the United States based on where their clients were. And they were putting, 300,000 square foot buildings in, Minot, North Dakota, and there's no labor. I mean, there's
Right.
nobody to work in these places. And it might be faster time to market, but if you don't have anyone to work there, it just doesn't work. So yeah, there's so many moving parts, and that's what I think makes it so much fun and interesting and different all the time.
Yes, well, terrific. Thank you so much for joining us today, Anne. It was so interesting to talk with you. And can you please give us your contact information if the listeners want to learn more about Colliers or get in touch with you?
Yes, it's Anne Dempsey, and my email is Anne, ANNE Dempsey, DEMPSEY @colliers.com. And my phone number is 847-989-8359. And would be happy to help anyone if they have any questions.
Terrific. And you can listen to more Frictionless Supply Chain podcasts on Supply Chain Management Reviews landing page, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can reach me, Rosemary Coates, at rcoates@reshoringinstitute.org, and visit our website, www.reshoringinstitute.org, where we publish all of our research on manufacturing in America. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for having me.